The story you're about to hear was told to me in the strictest of confidence. Certain names, dates, and locations may have been changed to protect that confidence. Events that feature in this story may be part of the public record. If you believe you recognize any of the people, places, or events that feature in this story, I ask you not to reveal any information publicly, out of respect for the subject's right to remain anonymous. My name is David Paul Nixon, and this is the New Ghost Stories podcast, where we delve into the New Ghost Stories archive to hear witness accounts of the supernatural. Stories that could be delusions, lies, fantasies, or perhaps even the real thing. Just don't make your mind up until you've listened. As this is the second part of a two-part story, I'll keep my comments brief. This is the finale of Season 2 of the New Ghost Stories podcast, so I want to take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to everyone who has listened to and supported the podcast. I want to extend my gratitude to anyone who has tweeted, posted about it, recommended it, reviewed it, or messaged me about it. I really do appreciate it. Even though I only put out a monthly episode, it still takes a remarkable amount of work to get each one out there. The response to the podcast, seeing it grow each month, it really keeps me going when the monthly deadline is looming and the clock is ticking away. We will of course be back with more full-length cases soon. Season 3 will begin in October, just in time for Halloween. In the meantime, there'll be some bonus content going live to bridge the gap, so please do keep an eye on the feed between now and then. And if you have been listening and enjoying it, please do leave a review, mention it on social media, and spread the word. It really helps the show to grow. Now let's get back to the story. This is part 2 of New Ghost Stories case number 246, Prince of Foxes, and you can hear it in full after these messages. Just a heads up to say that the narrator of this story is female. First day back at school, I had to have a private talk with my new form tutor, Mr. Summersby. He taught me maths in the first year. Lots of the girls fancied him, and to be fair, he looked all right back then. When the class had gone for a break, he asked me to stay behind, and I thought I was in trouble for smoking. What he really wanted to say was sorry about my dad dying. You could imagine how tough that was, and if I ever needed to, I could talk to him any time I wanted. This was out of the blue, someone taking time to ask how I was. It's amazing how invisible you are if you just keep yourself quiet. Teachers pay attention to the noisy kids. You have to be a pain in the arse before they care about the quiet ones. I didn't give much away, but I did let slip that Mum was already shacked up with someone else. That bothered him, but I didn't talk much, said that I was okay. I spent most of the time looking after my little brother. I could have told him everything, but I didn't see the point. I didn't think he could help me. And I had more reason to be afraid of my parents, Mum and Terry, than ever before. I'd always been taught to be secretive and not to tell people things. That's probably why all my friends were foxes. He wasn't very satisfied, but I had classes to go to, so that was the end of that. Problem was that he had a nephew, a little scrawny thing called Guy. He was in my year, and if I looked a bit old for my age, he looked a lot younger. He was really small and innocent. I think he had a thing for me. We walked the same way home, and he'd try to catch up with me or wait for me so he could walk with me. He didn't give up for a while. I wasn't very nice to him, but he was pretty harmless. It all stopped eventually. When it started to get dark early, he insisted on walking me all the way home, as if I needed protecting. I said whatever, it's your time to waste. Maybe he thought I was playing hard to get. When we got there, he got a view of what my life was really like. The house was looking a lot worse. The front garden was overgrown and in a mess. Some of the junk Terry had taken out of the attic was there, wet and rotten. And Terry and Mum were having a shouting match. a proper row you could hear down the road. He said, "Is that your mum and dad shouting?" "It's my mum and her boyfriend," I said back. "They do this all the time." Guy didn't try to walk home with me again after that. He'd been well scared off. He told Mr. Summersby all about it, though. A few days after, he asked me again for a private chat. He was concerned about my home situation. He said it wasn't because of what his nephew had said, although it was. He kept mentioning my parents having fights, but he was also talking about lateness days off, me looking after my baby brother. It didn't help that I'd come in with baby formula on my shirt after Connor had spit on me. He was asking a lot of questions. No one had really done this to me before. I used to just fob people off about my parents. If they didn't turn up to parents' evening, it was because they were busy. If my school uniform was dirty, it was because the washing machine was still broken. If I had a bruise, it was because I'd fallen over. Perhaps if I'd had more bruises, a teacher would have asked me before. That would have been big and obvious for them to notice. The cuts I gave myself I made high up on my legs so no one would see them. But I was starting to crack up. When he kept asking questions, my heart started thumping. The night before, I'd gone to the kitchen for something to drink late at night, and Terry was sat in there. I didn't even notice until he said, "What are you up to?" I screamed a little. I was so surprised. "Calm down, I'm just saying hello." I poured myself some milk from the fridge and went quickly for the door. "What's your rush?" He put his leg out to stop me. "I'm tired. Stay, keep us company for a bit. Your mother's fast asleep." "No, thank you. Why not?" "I'm tired, I just told you." "You don't like me much, do you?" I skipped over his leg and went back upstairs. I went to the bathroom a few minutes later, and when I came out, he was on the landing waiting for me. "You look nice in your nightie." I didn't say anything and tried to walk around him. "You should be nice to me." I tried to push past, but he shoved me back hard. "You're a cheeky bitch, aren't you? I work all day and night, pay for your food and your clothes and everything else, and you can't even be nice to me. What do you want? Maybe you should do some work for a change. I can think of a few folk who'd be interested in your talents." They tried to grab me between the legs. I screamed and I hit at him until he let me go. I ran to my bedroom and barricaded the door so fast I could hear him laughing in the hallway. I was running out of options. It wasn't safe for me there. I was between a rock and a hard place. I wanted to scream and stay silent. I wanted to stay quiet like I always did, but I knew I couldn't keep doing that forever. It was tearing me apart. I just started to blurt things out to Mr. Summersby. "Mum's not a very good parent. I have to check up on her, make sure Connor's okay." "But that's not your responsibility to look after him," Mr. Summersby said. "You're only 12, you're at school. I'm 13 next week. But you're supposed to be studying. That's just how it is, isn't it?" "And this man, Terry, what is he like?" Couldn't tell him. I just couldn't. I felt my heart thumping and tears starting up in my eyes. He helps me sometimes. Makes sure Mum does what she's supposed to. Still, I'm very concerned about this. It's not your problem. It is if it's interrupting your schoolwork. It won't. I'll try harder. That's not the point. I didn't ask for your help. I was trembling. I didn't want his help. I just daren't ask for it. "Can I go now?" Before I left, he said, "You can ask for it, though, any time you want. I'll be here for you. You can trust me." I didn't answer him. If only he'd known what he was getting himself into. A day or two later, I got home and I could hear Connor crying. He was on the floor in the living room. He wasn't old enough to crawl, but he kept trying. He'd roll over, get stuck and start crying. I didn't know how long he'd been on the floor, but he was screaming his eyes out. His nappy was dirty. He could have been there for hours. Mum was on the sofa, passed out. Her own child was screaming his head off and she wasn't hearing it. I yelled at her, but she didn't do anything. I thought maybe something was wrong, so I started to shake her. She groaned and moaned, so she obviously wasn't dead. I shouted at her again. I went to clean Connor up. Didn't even know if he'd been fed. While I was making his formula, she staggered into the kitchen. She looked tired and hungover, but not hungover like she normally was. She was weird like a zombie. I started yelling at her again. I wondered if she could even hear me. Finally, she shouted back, "Everything's fine. Nothing happened. Get off my back." She wandered off, and that wasn't like her. First time in my life she didn't fight for the last word. Didn't understand things right away. Not until later when I was taking the bins out. There were syringes in the bin. Mum and Dad had done drugs. Dad had sold them sometimes. They weren't very secret about it, but they did it just sometimes, not all the time. I'd seen Mum a bit spacey before. Terry did a lot of weed, so she did too. I didn't know much about drugs then and what they do to you, but I knew if she was using syringes, she was now on something much worse. It was another great move by Terry. Why row with someone when you can give them something to keep them quiet all day? He was smart, you had to give him that. She'd have to do everything he wanted now if she wanted her fix. I had plenty of time to work this out. It was hours before I got Connor settled down. If it was like I thought it was, and he was trying to get her hooked on something, then I had a massive problem. I couldn't give a shit if she wanted to kill herself, but she had Connor to look after, and I couldn't be there all the time. Terry came home while I was trying to get him to sleep. I just didn't know what I could say to him. I couldn't tell him I knew what he was doing. I couldn't go accusing him of anything. I didn't know what he might do. But I was fuming. I was so angry and frightened and nearly hysterical. That's probably why Connor wouldn't go to sleep, because I was like a crazy person about to blow. When I went downstairs, I had to try and walk normal. If I went down there marching, girl on a mission, he'd get nasty with me. I had to try and be calm. He was on the sofa smoking with a can of Carling next to him. I walked up to him and froze. I couldn't think what to say. "What do you want?" He wasn't in a good mood. I had to put my hands behind my back so he couldn't see me trembling. "I got home today and Connor was crying. Mum had left him on the floor." He smoked his cigarette and didn't say anything. "She was passed out on the sofa. He was crying his head off and she didn't even notice." "But you sorted it out." "Yes, I sorted it out. So it's okay then." "That's not the point. Connor can't be left on his own. He's only 6 months old." "I don't know what you want me to do about it. Talk to your mum." Like my heart was pounding in my head. I had fear and anger pulling me in both directions. I felt like I might explode. "You can't give her that stuff. Not while she's looking after Connor." "What's that?" He twitched, but that's it. "I don't know what she's taking, but she can't have it if she has Connor to look after." "I don't know what you're talking about." He stubbed his cigarette out. I wasn't getting through. My brother's life was in danger, but I couldn't get through to him. "She's on drugs and she's supposed to be looking after her son." He took a swig of lager. "Don't you understand? He could die, he could get hurt. Anything could happen to him. You can't give her that shit anymore, whatever it is." "I don't take orders from you." I just lost it. I screamed, "Oh, you'd better listen. Because if I come home and she's like that again, I'm going to be straight on the phone to social services." He was off the sofa like lightning. He pushed me across the room until I went smack bang against the wall. His forearm was shoved right up against my neck. I was on my tiptoes. I was choking. I couldn't breathe. He watched me struggle. "No, you won't. You're going to behave yourself, aren't you?" I tried to nod. "This is my house," he screamed straight in my face. "And you'll do what I tell you, or else I'll fuck you. I will fuck you up." And he started talking quiet again. "You understand me, don't you?" He was sarcastic, but I nodded anyway. "Good girl. Now get the fuck out of my sight." He dropped his arm and I got out of there. I landed on all fours in the hallway. Coughing and choking, I crawled to the back door and got myself out. I ran. I went over the fence for the first time in months and ran through the grass. I didn't go looking for the foxes, not deliberately. But when I couldn't see them, I made my mind up to find them. I ended up walking along the disused rail line. I don't know why I thought that would take me anywhere. I just had to go somewhere. I walked maybe half a mile. I found an old railway tunnel that went into the side of a steep hill. A road ran above it. The car headlights shone some light on us as they drove over. I stood at the opening of the tunnel, and dozens of little eyes stared back at me. The boy walked out of the dark. He looked tall and strong and mature. Foxes surrounded us. We stood staring at each other for just a moment. Then I threw my arms around him and cried. I let it all out. He held me. I don't know how long I was there in his arms. It felt like a long time. When I finally let go, it was like something had passed between us. He stared at me and then slowly walked back into the tunnel. Somehow I knew I had to leave him then. Something in me said that now things were going to be all right. He was there for me, and things would be okay. I don't know how I knew. I just knew. And I was right. 2 days later, I was walking home when a fox came up to me in the street. He just strolled on up to me as if there was nothing weird about it at all. It was my friend with the torn ear. He stared at me for a second and then turned around and went walking away. He kept looking back to me to see if I'd follow him. So I did. He had me walking for miles. I didn't know how long this was going to take, but I knew it had to be important. He took me out to the middle of the town where there were factories and offices and warehouses. Did you know foxes can climb trees? Half he took me to a brick wall, and then, to get over, he went straight up a tree and along a branch to get on top. I had to jump up and pull myself up. It took a couple of goes, but I got up there. He didn't warn me about the rows of rusted barbed wire hanging over the other side. I got over it. It wasn't sharp anymore, just hard to get around. I was still in my school uniform. I wasn't dressed for any of this. I landed in a yard. It was a really popular place for fly tipping. There was junk everywhere. Someone had managed to get a whole fridge freezer over the wall. It's got to be easier to just take it to the tip, surely. There was a tall factory building there. It was 3 or 4 floors high. It looked kind of weird, this big building surrounded by open space. It looked like there might have been other buildings once because you could still see some foundations. There weren't any lights on. Most of the windows were boarded up. It was a derelict. I was going to creep closer, but the yard was lit up by headlights. I ducked down behind the fridge. I heard the old gate being opened. A van drove into the yard. The headlights went off. It was pretty dark, but I could see a couple of guys get out. They didn't go to the front doors. They went around the side of the building to some stairs that went down to a basement door. A fat guy came up to meet them. I had to look hard before I realised they were Terry's mates. I'd seen them hanging around with him and Dad. I remembered this was his business, security for old buildings, factories and derelicts. Guys started coming up the stairs with boxes and they were loading them into the back of a van. It took them maybe 5 minutes. They were pretty quick. When it was all done, they said goodbye to the fat guy and drove back out, only turning the headlights on when they were through the gate. I waited a couple more minutes to come out of hiding. I went to the basement stairs and walked down quietly. There was a heavy door with no handle on the outside. There was a window next to it that was not boarded up, but it had iron bars over it. I looked in. It was dark and hard to see anything. Then there was this sudden flash of light, and a man appeared from nowhere. The light disappeared just as fast. I panicked and ran up the stairs, which was stupid because they were made of metal and I made a racket. I must have been lucky because nobody came after me. Half here had also deserted me by then. I had to drag that fridge freezer to the wall to climb out. I had a long walk home to help me figure out what had happened, and it took me a while, but I got what the foxes were showing me. It was a weed farm. Clever Terry. Old factories and empty buildings are great places to grow weed. No one's going to come looking around, not when you're the security who are there to keep the place safe. You can hook yourselves up to the power and do your growing in private. I guess buildings with basements are best because you wouldn't want people to see the light. That flash of light I saw was one of those rubber flap doorways you get. Someone had pushed through and the bright light had got out for just a second. You can't grow plants in the dark. It was a good idea, really. Shame a scumbag like Terry came up with it. A lot of weed had come out of that building. I wondered how much money it was making him. Had a feeling I could go up to the attic and find out. That had to be where he was stashing his cash, as well as whatever he was giving Mum. But he couldn't be in this on his own. He had to have partners, people to work with to get the stuff out. People he might get in trouble with if he upset them. I was making guesses, but they made sense. The Foxes had shown me this place for a reason, so I could take Terry down. Who knew how many weed farms he had? But there had to be a lot of money in this one, and if something happened to all that money, then bad things would probably happen to Terry. Either his partners were going to get upset, or the police were going to wonder why this burning building smelt a lot like a giant spliff. Seemed like the easiest thing to do. Set the whole place on fire. I waited until the next night. It was dark by the time I left school. I changed in the toilets into my best black gear. I had plenty of black clothes. I was starting to go a bit goth. I'd taken the spare petrol can from Mum's car. It was empty, but I passed the petrol station on my way too. Nobody asked any questions. Bought myself a new lighter while I was there. I went the same way I did the day before, climbed over the wall in the same place with the petrol can in my backpack. It was amazingly easy, really. All I had to have a think about was how I could get the fire to really take hold. The basement door meant I had a really good place to get it started. There was tons of rubbish I could use for fuel. That stuff would go up a treat, but would it be enough to get the whole building going? I put bags of rubbish and cardboard down the stairs. I was worried I might be making too much noise, but I could hear a radio going inside, so it didn't need to be very quiet. I had to make sure the fire got inside somehow. If I poured petrol around the door, I could be sure some would get in under it. That was a start, but it wasn't enough. I found an old beer bottle in the rubbish and made myself a petrol bomb with a bit of newspaper. I filled the space around the door right up to the bottom of the window. I poured out the petrol, some over the rubbish, lots down by the doorway, and plenty around the window. I wasn't sure I could get the petrol bomb through the window, so I threw a rock first. I scored a direct hit, breaking the glass. Then I lit the paper in the bottle and threw that at the window. It didn't get through. It broke on the bars and made this big explosion of flames. A ring of fire burned around the window and it ran straight onto the rubbish. I had some sacks of rubbish left. I threw them against the window thinking some of the burning stuff might fall through. I had 3 bags, but I lost my nerve after throwing the first 2. There were noises now coming from inside. I hadn't thought about how the people inside were going to get out. I just thought there must be other ways out. I didn't hear about anyone getting hurt. I ran back over the yard and got up on the wall. I sat on top and watched the fire for a few seconds. I realised then that it didn't matter if the whole thing went up. All I needed to cause trouble was to get the police to notice. I mean, you're probably thinking, why didn't I just call the police in the first place? I don't think I ever really thought about it. I had no reason to trust them. All my parents had ever done was say bad things about them. And I wanted to do this to Terry. I wanted to hurt him myself. I changed back into my school uniform in a McDonald's toilet on the way back. I didn't know what I was going to come home to. Terry had a mobile. He might know already. He might be at home, but he might not be. I hoped he'd just bolt and never come back. But if there was cash up in the attic, he'd have to come back for it. As long as he was gone, I didn't really care. Didn't really know what would happen. In my head, some nightmare scenarios were playing out. like Terry deciding to take Connor away with him. Or if he somehow found out it was me, even though there was no reason for him to think it was, there might be some clue I'd left. I almost left the petrol can behind. Then I'd end up dead. I don't think I'd really thought the whole thing through. I wanted to save me and Connor, but if I died or got sent to prison, who'd look after him? Who'd make sure he was safe? There was no point being a hero if Connor wasn't safe. I felt knots tying in my stomach. I'd been anxious all day. That afternoon before I did it, I was having second thoughts, even though I knew I couldn't pull out. My last lesson at school was with Mr. Summersby. I was the last one to leave the class. I went up to him at his desk. "Sir?" "Yes, Katie?" "Did you mean what you said about being there if I wanted to ask for help? Something the matter?" "Not yet, I just wanted to know. I'm happy to help you with anything. All you have to do is ask, any time." I nodded and I left. He called after me, but I left it there. It wasn't much, but I needed to feel like I had some kind of safety net and someone real who could help me. I just had to hope that he meant it. When I got home, Mum came straight for me. "Have you seen Terry?" She was in a panic. Losing money would do that to her. "No, why would I? I need to speak to him, it's important." "What do you want me to do? I'm not going to see him before you do. Don't get smart with me, this is not the fucking time." She was too nervous to really get on at me. She was pacing around. She kept trying to get him on the phone. I heard a little squeal from the living room. Connor was still up, playing with his blocks. I knew he was going to be a smart one. He was always building with his blocks. He'd started speaking a little by then. He used to call me KB. He was saying that ages before he said mama or dada. And it's tough to get him to sleep because I think he knew how scared I was. The waiting was the worst part. At least I thought it was. It was all so random. The more I thought about it, the more I realised I didn't know anything. And I didn't know what was going to happen. Then Terry got home. It happened with a bang. The front door slammed and I felt my heart stop. Connor had only just fallen asleep. I was still in his room watching him. I heard footsteps stomping up the stairs. I heard Mum shrieking, "Where the hell have you been?" Terry wasn't answering her. "They've been calling me all night trying to find you. Why didn't you answer?" I heard the attic steps hit the landing. This is it, I thought. He's going to take his money and run. I watched through a gap in the doorway. "What's going on, Terry? Why are you ignoring me?" She started up the ladder. What's happened? What's happened with Jesus?" She slipped down the ladder and fell on the floor. Terry stepped down. He had a sawn-off shotgun. He was pointing it at Mum. She backed away up against the wall. He put the end of the gun against her face. "Stop it, Terry! Please don't point that at me! Stop it! Stop it!" He got right up close to her. She was crying. "What's the golden rule?" he said. His eyes were wild. He looked terrifying. "What's the golden fucking rule?" "We don't talk about the business." "We don't talk about the business. That's right. You don't stick your nose in and you keep your mouth shut." "So what did you hear on the phone?" Mum was crying. "Nothing. I heard nothing." "Yeah, that's right. You heard nothing." Lowered the gun. "I just got worried about you and all that money, our money up in smoke." Our money? Our money? That's a fucking laugh, isn't it?" He was poking her in the stomach with the gun. "When did you do fucking anything other than moan and complain and fucking nag and go on and on and on? You never earned a fucking penny in your whole life. Never done a fucking day's work in your whole life." Mum was wailing, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you worry, darling. Terry's going to take care of it. Terry's going to look after everything for you, like always." He went down the stairs. Mum landed on all fours. "Terry, wait!" she screamed. Come back here!" She got up and ran after him. I heard the front door hit the wall and the sound of her voice screeching outside. For a little time, things were quiet. Connor had slept through the whole thing. He wasn't going to run. He was going to fight. He was off after someone. But whatever was in the attic, he'd left it behind, except for the gun. He'd been keeping weapons in the house. I had to know what was up there. Here was my chance. I went up the ladder. I thought I was going to see big sacks of cash or bricks of cocaine, but when I got up there was hardly anything at all. There was a filing cabinet with all the drawers locked. There was a chair and a table. There were newspapers on the table with doodles and scribbles on them. There was an armchair and a box next to it with porn mags in. Terry couldn't just be going up there for a wank. The filing cabinet must have something in it, but you wouldn't hide something important in a drawer. It was too obvious. I heard the front door slam. Mum was back. I slid down the ladder and hid myself back in Connor's room. She was crying downstairs. I decided to stay with Connor. Just had to wait again. Maybe he wouldn't come back. He might get himself shot or picked up by the police. But he did come back, hours later. I'd fallen asleep on the floor. I wouldn't have thought that was possible, but it takes it out of you, all the stress. I must have drifted off. I heard him on his phone in the garden. He was trying to talk to someone and be quiet, but he kept shouting and getting angry. He swore a lot. I couldn't really hear what he said without opening the window, and he'd probably hear that. He came upstairs later and went into his and Mum's room. I could hear them talking, but that didn't last long. They were fucking minutes later. It seemed like whatever was going to happen was over for the night. There was going to be more drama. It was looking like Terry wasn't going to take off after all. I got off the floor, checked Connor was okay, and went back to my room to sleep. There'd still be trouble about the factory. I just had to hold on and keep waiting. I'd set fire to more places if I had to. I just had to do what I always did, what I did best. Keep my head down and stay quiet. Turns out that of all the things I'd done, going back to my bedroom to sleep turned out to be the worst decision of all. When I woke up in the morning, Connor was gone. I didn't panic, not at first. Mum might have got up early and taken him downstairs, but when I checked there was no one around. That's when I started to lose it. Mum was fast asleep. There was no one in the whole house. Terry was gone, and I thought he'd taken Connor with him. I'd have to call the police and tell them everything. I didn't care what happened to me. I didn't care. All Connor's things were still there, but Terry was crazy enough not to care about taking them. Then I saw that the back door was open. I went out onto the patio. There was an old cracked plate there, and there was a dummy on it. Connor's dummy. The foxes had taken Connor in the night. I didn't understand. Why would they do that? They were supposed to be my friends. What had they done? I walked through the overgrown grass in my slippers, wearing my pajamas in the freezing cold. It was still dark outside. There was fog everywhere. I got down to the old rail track and started to run. He was in the fog, standing waiting for me, but Connor wasn't with him. Where is he? I pushed him. He grabbed my arms. I struggled. He pushed me down onto the track. They were outside the tunnel. I could hear a baby cry. It was Connor. I was sure. I could tell. I got to my feet. The boy looked ready to stop me. I looked back at him and into the tunnel. There were shadows there, lots of them. They looked like children. Loads of children. The little bossy girl appeared out of the weeds. She held a naked baby. I went straight for it, but when I put my arms out, I saw it wasn't Connor. It was a different baby. Where is he? He's safe. We're looking after him. But why have you taken him? I was looking after him. He was not safe, the girl shouted. You are a bad mother. I was about to say I wasn't his mother, but he hadn't anyone else. No one else cared about him, not really, not properly. I'm looking after him. I'm taking care of him. I was starting to cry. He's not safe. There is a predator in the house. We told you if you could not look after him, we would take him. I tried. I thought I was doing what you wanted. He will not be safe until the predator is gone." From nowhere, the boy pulled out a knife, and I nearly screamed. "You have to kill the predator," she said. "Then it will be safe." I looked at her, and I looked at him. He held a bread knife. It was old and rusty. "Who are you?" I shouted. "What are you?" "We're the lost children, and we look after our own." The little baby started to cry. The little girl, who was barely big enough to carry him, started to rock him side to side. The boy dropped the knife. The two of them walked back into the tunnel. Foxes ran through the grass after them. I watched them and looked down at the knife. I picked it up with my hands shaking. Any knife would probably have been better for killing, but this is what they'd given me. I walked back wanting to be sick. I wanted Terry dead. Christ, I did. But kill someone and get away with it. He was bigger than me, stronger than me, better than me. But I had to do it and get away with it. Not for me, but for Connor. To save him from whatever it was that they'd do to him. Turn him into a fox, eat him. I don't know. I didn't understand. It didn't make sense, but I didn't have any time to think about it. Connor was my responsibility. I was his mother. I had to do it. I had to get rid of Terry once and for all. I had to be strong. I had to be smart. I had to be clever. It was so cold it was hurting me. I went over the fence and back into the garden. I moved the plate and the dummy. I had some time to plan. It was only 8 in the morning. Couldn't kill Terry in the house. I could get hurt and had to get rid of the body. I thought about the land outside the house where the foxes were. The body could go down there. Nobody went down there except me. I could hide him in the bushes. The foxes could eat him for all I cared. But how could I get him down there? And I had another problem. What was Mum going to do? I wouldn't have minded killing her too, but I needed her. I couldn't raise Connor on my own, not legally. She had to stay around. But she wanted Terry, and more than that, she wanted his money. She could be up at any time. What was I going to tell her about Connor? I was going to skip school, that was obvious, but what could I do with Connor? My mind was all over the place. And then there was a knock at the door. I looked into the hallway. Through the frosted glass, I could see people outside. It was the police. They knocked a second time. Mum wouldn't get up, I was sure. Even if she was awake, she was used to hiding from the pigs. I saw one go look through the living room window. They went after a few minutes. I didn't need them on my back too. I already had enough on my plate. I moved fast. Even though Connor was gone, I got his pushchair ready and all the things I needed to take him out. I went to Mum's room and woke her up. "I'm taking Connor for his doctor's appointment." "What appointment?" "His checkup." "What checkup?" "I knew you'd forget." "He never said anything about an appointment." "Yes, I did. I knew you'd forget. I'm taking the day off school to do it." Best thing I could do was get myself out of there and she wouldn't realise Connor was gone. It was totally surreal. I was walking for hours with an empty pushchair. I had to bulk it up to make it look like he was in there. I was worried the police were watching, but no one followed me down the street. I called school from a payphone to say Mum was ill, so I was looking after Connor. It was freezing, and I had almost no money. I bought a McDonald's breakfast, but I was too worried to sit down in there all day. My plan, which I was still working out, depended on Mum getting off her face and putting herself out of action. I figured if she was on her own for hours, she'd have no reason not to get stoned. I also needed it to get dark. I couldn't take care of Terry in the daylight, and I had to find out where his money was. I spent hours walking around in circles. I drifted back to my house at about 1 o'clock. I was scared I was being watched. If the police were watching, they wouldn't do it from a cop car. They'd use a normal one. But they didn't know what I looked like, so I went up and down the street to see if anyone was watching. Stupid thing was that if I got back and Mum was still up and about, I'd have to go away and come back again. I checked the cars were all empty and then risked going to the front door. I listened in. I couldn't hear anything but the radio in the kitchen. The living room looked empty. I had to chance it. I unlocked the door so quietly, and once I was in, I checked out the downstairs and then headed upstairs. She was in her room in a dressing gown. She was lying face up on the bed, gone to the world. I'd been lucky. It looked like she got out the shower, thought fuck it, and got high. Her dressing gown was open. She was flashing the world, stoned off her face. Could have just done her in then and there. And believe me, I thought about it. But it was too messy, and there'd be a body. And the police would know she'd been murdered, so I decided against it. What I needed to do was go back up to the attic. I hadn't heard Terry go up in the morning, so I guessed what I was looking for was still there. I could break open the filing cabinet, but what was the point? He wouldn't put his money somewhere so obvious. He'd have to hide it. There was nothing else in there. I checked the seat cushions on the chairs, rummaged through his porn, but I knew I'd never find it there. I thought about the floorboards, but that'd be too noisy. He wasn't going to go hammering around at night. And then I just had this idea to look up at the roof. It all snapped into place. I could see a little join in the roof insulation. I just reached up and pulled, stripped it off, and down fell the money, wads of cash tied up with elastic bands. It was almost fun. I tore off the insulation and made it rain cash. Now I had the bait for my trap. There was so much money. I didn't have time to count it. It was all in 50s and 20s. I filled up this sports bag and had to fill all the pockets, and I still couldn't fit it all in. I had a dozen wads of cash left over. I stashed them in my room just in case. Terry had filled almost a whole side of the roof. It was incredible. I couldn't believe he'd hoarded all this money. What was he going to do with it all? I didn't waste time thinking about it. I went back to Mum's room and slowly, quietly, I turned the whole place over. I opened up and tipped out drawers, messed up her closet, scattered her shoes, emptied shoe boxes and her jewellery boxes. I made it look like someone had gone through the place to find her valuables and steal them. After I'd made a load of mess, I closed the door and found something to wedge under the handle. A little bookcase from Connor's room did the job. No matter how long she was high, she couldn't get out now. I trashed the whole house, turned the whole place upside down. I wrecked the kitchen, threw things out of drawers and emptied out cupboards. I pulled up the carpet in the dining room, turned over potted plants. I tore open seat covers in the living room, wrecked the telly and tipped over this big display cabinet. If I hadn't been so tensed up, I would have had fun. When I was done, I took a shovel from the shed and went to the wasteland and dug myself a hole. I did it behind some young trees and bushes just to be sure I wouldn't be spotted. I didn't need the hole to be deep, just to cover the bag of money. I buried it and went back to the house. I had to wait till it started to get dark. It was winter, so it only took an hour or two. When the sun was almost gone, I got on the phone. It went straight to his answer phone. "Terry, some guys have been over. They've wrecked the place. Turned every room upside down. You need to get over here now." I hung up and waited again. The seconds just got more unbearable and unbearable. You know, this was it. My life on the line. Connor's life on the line. Life and death, waiting for it to happen. I sat on the stairs with my heart pumping, watching for his car to appear out front. I got to my feet when it did. I saw his shape appear in the glass, coming to the door. Longest few seconds of my life. He threw it open and came right up to me. "What's happened?" he shouted. "Two guys were here. They were smashing the place up when I got home." He pushed past and started up to the attic and saw the ladder on the landing. "Yeah, they went up there, but they didn't find your money. No need to panic." He spun round. He had that look on his face again. You were lucky, I shouted. I had to get his attention and stop him from seeing Mum's room blocked up. All they had to do was look up and spot the roof was all messed up and out of shape. Took me 30 seconds to find it. He went to grab me and I pushed him away but slipped and fell down the last few stairs. I was back up on my feet before he could touch me. I saved your money, don't worry. I thought they might be back. They ran out when I got home. He was sizing me up, deciding whether to listen or rip my head off. I hid your money in case they came back. I didn't think they'd be scared off long by a girl. He tried to grab me by the shirt. When I stopped him, he got hold of my hair instead. You show me where my fucking money is, you show me right now. Let go and I'll show you. Pushed him and he let his grip slip. It's this way. I shoved him for a change and led him to the garden. Mum and Connor are okay, by the way. But he didn't care. I took him to the fence. It's on the other side. I hid it where no one would look. Yeah, well, you go first. I needed him to get ahead of me. I went over and waited for him to climb after me. When he landed, his jacket dragged on top of the fence. I saw the shotgun stuffed into the back of his trousers. I was breathless, speechless for a second. Where now? I pointed with my arms shaking. Over there by those trees and bushes. He started off and I followed him. I couldn't do it straight away. I had to wait till he was a bit further away from the houses and windows and risk of people watching. This was it. This was the time to do it. I had the fox's knife with me. Why I didn't swap it for a better one, I don't know. He was walking in front of me. I was staring at his back. All I had to do was raise my arm and push it in. Just push it forward and push it in. I held the knife out. I could see it shake. He was walking fast. I had to skip to catch up. And then I slipped. And he looked round at me and he saw it. What the fuck is this? Suddenly he was smiling at me. He started to laugh. Well, what do we have here? I stepped back. Well, go on then, he shouted. I looked at him. I looked at the knife. He hit me. I fell down and I lost the knife. He jumped on me. He grabbed my hair and hit me in the face. Where the fuck is my money? I thought this was it. He's going to kill me. He raised his fist again. I turned to look away. And then I saw the foxes come. One ran up his back and put his teeth right through his ear. Terry bolted up and the fox fell, taking half his ear with him. They were jumping up and scratching, clawing his legs, scratching at his back and at his belly. Some were running and butting him in the stomach. He was swearing and shouting and stumbling about, but he was still on both feet. I saw him reach for the shotgun. I found a rotting tree branch in the grass. I couldn't let him shoot them. Terry couldn't aim the gun. The foxes were climbing all over him and clawing and butting and scratching at him. He wasn't looking at me and only just saw me the second before I smacked him. The end of the branch broke off and I whacked him on the forehead. It was so satisfying. He fell down and the foxes surrounded him, but instead of tearing at him, they looked to me to give him the fatal blow. He tried to roll on his side. He was reaching around for his shotgun in the grass. I gave him another smack in the head. I kept smacking him until there was nothing left of that rotten branch. He was face down in the grass. He'd stopped moving. I could see blood in his hair. The foxes moved in. They took hold of Terry with their teeth. They pulled and struggled and dragged him through the grass. I followed them. I should have helped, really. I knew where he was going. We went over one rail line and on to the next, to the same spot in the chain-link fence where I went when I thought I couldn't take it anymore. I held up the broken part so they could drag Terry through. I watched them pull him onto the tracks and then run for safety. There was a train coming. I watched Terry to see if he would move. I didn't know if I'd killed him or not. Train lights were bright. The driver saw him, but the train was going too fast. There was the shrieking sound of the brakes. I watched Terry as the train wheels crunched him up. I saw his feet and legs spin around as the wheels went over him. For a moment, I felt nothing. I was frozen to the spot. I only went to hide when I saw the driver's door open. I crawled through the grass and went back to the old train track. I walked down the track almost calmly. My heartbeat went steady. It was done. I'd done what they asked for. I felt strong. I didn't feel 1 ounce of guilt for Terry. Not one bit. I didn't run. I walked slowly. I knew they'd be waiting for me. He was guarding the tunnel entrance when I got there. He stared at me, and I stared back at him. "Where's my brother?" He did nothing. He just kept looking at me. I pulled out the knife, the one he'd given me. I pointed it at his chest, not even an inch away, and said, "Give me back my brother." He smiled and stepped back. The little girl came along, and she had Connor with him. He was wrapped up in one of his blankets, and he seemed happy. I started crying when I saw him. I was so happy he was okay. I held him so tight, my little brother. The 2 of them watched me, and there were others too, more children, more foxes, eyes staring at me in the dark. The little fox cub curled itself around the little girl's feet, like a cat trying to get her attention. "Are they all children?" I asked them. "Are all the foxes children?" "Not every fox. We're very special because we got a second chance to be alive. Now we're one big, happy family." I saw the boy smile at her. It was the only time I ever saw him smile. They held hands, and I watched them walk away into the dark. I took Connor home. One last walk along the rail track. I wasn't scared anymore. The most amazing thing had happened. I felt unstoppable. I felt like I deserved to be a mother. His mother. I felt strong enough to do one last thing, to make our lives better. I was going to take one last risk, because I felt like I could do anything now. When I got back home, I could hear Mum struggling upstairs. I didn't rush to her. I put Connor in his pushchair, and he was calm and as chilled out as he'd ever been. I went upstairs and moved the bookcase. Mum was through the door before I could say a word. "What the fuck is going on?" She looked up at the attic and then back at me. "Come downstairs, I'll tell you all about it." I went and sat myself down by the kitchen table and waited for her to get there. She was going through all the rooms and flipping out over the damage. "What the fuck's happened, Katie?" "Sit yourself down and we'll talk." "Don't play games with me. Who did this?" "Just sit down and let me tell you." She picked up a chair and slammed it down by the table. "Terry's gone, Mum." "What are you talking about? Who the fuck did this to our house?" Terry flipped out. He upset a few people. They had to take care of him. Look outside if you don't believe me. See all those lights? I pointed out the kitchen window. Those are ambulances and police cars. They did him in and threw him under a train. She stood and stared out the window. "You're lying. Don't you fucking lie to me. This isn't the time for your fucking games." "You're not very lucky, are you? One husband dies in a car accident. Your next boyfriend goes under a train. Better tell the next guy you suck off not to get on an aeroplane." She went for me, but I just leant back on my chair and took Terry's shotgun out from under the table. She was so shocked she backed right off. "You can't point that at me. I'm your mother. Put it down." "Money's gone, Mum. I helped them find it. I didn't want it. I've already got money waiting for me. This is all that's left. I threw a Tesco bag on the table with everything left from Terry's haul in it. Take it and go. I'll look after Connor, like always. The police will be here soon. They'll want to know about the money, and even if they don't throw you in jail, Terry's friends will probably want to keep you quiet. You fucking little bitch! It's better than you deserve. I got up and put the gun to her head. You remember, Dad? What you did to him? You let him die like he was nothing. There's your fucking money. There's your fucking payday. You got 5 minutes to grab your shit and go. I'm going to tell the cops all about you, and that's only if Terry's mates don't come and get you first. She wasn't moving. So I screamed, "Go!" jabbed her with the gun, and she got the message. She grabbed the carrier bag and went upstairs. I lit up a cigarette and waited for her to get going. She packed a suitcase pretty quick. She came downstairs and took one last look at me, as if I was going to do something to suddenly save her. I stared right back at her. Aren't you proud of me? Admit it, you couldn't have done better yourself. She turned and she went. I got the last word after all. When I saw her car go by, I knew it was over. It was finally over. Nothing that was going to happen next was ever going to be so bad. My life, I knew, was never going to be as bad again. I did some more waiting. I wanted to give my mum a head start before I called the police. I wiped my fingerprints off the shotgun and put it behind the filing cabinet upstairs. I phoned the police after a couple of hours and said I knew who it was who'd gone under the train. When they came over, I let them in and told them my mum was gone. Then I told them I wasn't going to tell them anything, not unless I had it in writing that they were never going to take Connor away from me. I had leverage. If they wanted to know what happened, I needed to know that Connor was never going to go anywhere. I waited while they called in a social worker. She told me that because I was 13, I wasn't legally allowed to look after a child, but they'd do everything they could to keep us together. I told her I'd already been looking after Connor, and I didn't give a stuff about her rules and the law. I looked after Connor, and if they ever wanted to know what had happened at the house, they were going to have to try harder. After they talked it around, they asked if there was anyone they could call, a friend of the family or someone who could take responsibility for us both. I told them they could call Mr. Summersby. There wasn't anyone else. He came around at about 9 o'clock looking pretty shocked. He asked me what was going on. I said I needed to ask for his help now. And I needed him not to ask too many questions, not yet. I said that I knew I was asking a lot, but I needed his help and there was no one else to turn to. Eventually they agreed, him and the police and the social worker, that me and Connor could stay with him. I went and got all of Connor's things together. He just slept through all of this, calm about everything. I hadn't really thought about Mr. Summersby's family. He had a wife who was 7 months pregnant. She'd wanted a family. This wasn't what she was expecting. I said I was sorry to them both. He said he was going to help me out of this mess, but I needed to trust him. I said I'd tell him everything, but not now. I needed to sleep and rest. That gave me all night to think about what I was going to say to the police. That was good and bad because it meant I got to work on my story. It also meant I spent so much time worrying over details and not getting any rest. Like how come no one had tried to open the filing cabinet? I suppose they found the money first and didn't need to, officer. I took Connor with me to the police station the next day. Mrs. Summersby, Jill, she went with me. In my version of events, my mum knew everything. She and Terry talked about the money all the time. I'd been suspicious that she knew about my dad's death because I'd heard her on the phone with Terry that same night, before the police had called. Of course they'd been having an affair. I'd suspected for years, but I didn't want to say anything because I was afraid of them and I was young and I hated the police because that's what I'd been taught. I'd come home and caught two guys trashing the house. They'd blocked Mum in her room upstairs. When they couldn't find the money, they made me phone Terry. When he got home, one watched me in the house while the other took Terry outside and over the fence. When he came back, he said Terry had gone under the train. I described them as looking like the two people I saw at the factory. They left it pretty vague. They had masks on, obviously. They told me and Mum we should leave town and never come back. I told Mum I didn't want to go with her, and she said that was fine and left. It was hearing the whole story that won Jill over to helping me. She hadn't known what to think before, but now she really wanted to help me. It's funny, I don't feel bad about anything that I did, but I do feel bad about lying to them, Mr. and Mrs. Summersby. I didn't worry about them finding Mum and her telling a different story, because mine was much better and made more sense. After all, how was I going to have killed Terry? They asked me a lot of questions. I don't think the story tied together as well as they wanted it to, but it didn't matter. They interviewed me about 3 times over the next few weeks. The crime was never solved, and that was fine because I didn't really care. Mum never did show up again. I always thought I'd get a visit one day and find out she'd died of an overdose in some shithole, but for all I know she's still out there. I reckon she went on to the continent. A woman can get away with almost anything if she's always up for it, and Mum was always up for it, if there was something she could get out of it. Things worked out pretty well after it was all over. Eventually I was properly adopted. Jill and Bradley turned out to be really good people, and it was nice to know that there were really good people out there. They looked after me and Connor and they did it well. And we have a little sister too. Their little girl Emma was born, and her and Connor get on most of the time. He's done well in school. He's at university now. We sold Nan's house. I didn't really want to go back there. I sold that and split the money with Connor and with Emma because I owe my new family a lot. They're the parents I wished I'd had growing up. Connor is pretty normal. He doesn't remember anything about those old days. I used to think about us being poisoned, but there's nothing but goodness in Connor. He's grown up to be pretty special. I've still had problems. Too many to go through. I'm doing okay. It's never been as tough as it was back then. It casts a shadow over your life. I'm so glad Connor isn't damaged like I am. He gets along really well. Things really have turned out okay. Much better than I had any right to expect. There's actually been some perks. I've never had to worry about money. And I'm not just talking about the money I got from the house. About 2 weeks after I moved in with the Summersbys, I happened to just look into their garden. Theirs isn't back onto any wasteland. It's a pretty looked after garden. Jill's really into it. But there was a really muddy sports bag waiting for me there one day. One last present from my faithful friends. There are still foxes where I live now, but they're not the same. They don't work together, they're like normal. There's nothing special or magic about them, but I still leave them food sometimes. I've never told anyone why. I don't know what I saw back there in that tunnel and in Nan's garden. I don't know how a lost child can live again as a fox. But there are plenty of foxes and plenty of children who suffer. Maybe there's something good about them being saved and living again in some way. But I'd sooner be properly alive and be sort of normal than to have saved my brother. I owe the foxes so much. I'm so grateful to them. They made me strong. They taught me how to fight, how to protect what's important to me. And I've been fighting ever since. That's the one thing that's never really changed. I just keep my head down and stay quiet. No one expects anything or suspects anything when you keep your head down and you stay quiet. Thank you for listening to Season 2 of the New Ghost Stories podcast. The podcast was written and produced by me, David Paul Nixon. This story features in the book 14 New Ghost Stories, which is available from Amazon, Apple Books and other book retailers. If you'd like to find out more, join my Substack at davidpaulnixon.substack.com or visit my website at www.newghoststories.com. And if you'd like to support the podcast, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/newghoststories. You can also find me on Twitter and Instagram by searching at New Ghost Stories. Next time on the New Ghost Stories podcast, we have a classic story in our latest bonus episode. Tried to nod. "This is my house," he screamed straight in my face. "And you'll do what I tell you, or else I'll fuck you. I will fuck you up."